A man alone, swallowed by the pitch-black night, tires grinding against a forgotten road in the wilds of Colorado. The air is heavy, the silence deafening, until a shadow erupts from nowhere, a blur of motion and menace. Brakes scream. Metal groans. A sickening thud shatters the stillness. Then nothing but the frantic thudding of his heart. What was it? What's out there? Buckle up, because this isn't just a tale of a crash. It's a plunge into a man's unraveling soul, a collision with destiny, and a whisper of hope that might just pull him back from the edge. This is David's night, a night that will break him apart, stitch him back together, and leave you breathless. I'm promising you a story that'll grip your heart, twist your gut, and linger long after the last word fades. Ready? Let's dive into the darkness. The dashboard clock glowed a faint 12:47 a.m. as David gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. He was somewhere near Boulder, Colorado, on a rural highway that stretched endlessly into the void. Miles of nothing but scrubland and jagged peaks lurking in the distance. He'd been driving for hours, fresh off a soul-crushing business trip that had left him hollowed out, a shell of the man he used to be. His eyes burned, lids sagging like they were weighted with lead. The hum of the engine blurred into a hypnotic drone, lulling him towards sleep he couldn't afford. Desperate, he cranked the window down. A blast of frigid mountain air roared in, sharp as a blade against his cheeks. He sucked in a deep breath, the cold stinging his lungs, jolting him awake. For a fleeting second, the world snapped into focus, the faint glitter of stars overhead, the whisper of wind through the pines, the lonely stretch of asphalt gleaming under his headlights. It was almost serene, almost safe. Then it happened. A shadow, massive, swift, a phantom of the night, exploded into his path. It was too fast, too sudden. Time fractured. His foot slammed the brake pedal with every ounce of strength he had, tires clawing at the road in a high-pitched wail. The car fishtailed, the world tilting wildly. Too late. A bone-rattling crunch tore through the night, a sound so raw it felt like it ripped straight into his marrow. The impact jolted him forward, seatbelt biting into his chest, and then silence. Eerie, suffocating silence. David sat there, paralyzed, breath coming in shallow, jagged bursts. His heart hammered like a war drum, drowning out everything else. His hands shook as they clung to the wheel, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. What had he hit? A person? An animal? Something unnatural? The thought clawed at his mind, a dark seed of panic taking root. He fumbled with the door handle, fingers clumsy, and stumbled out into the night, boots crunching on loose gravel. The air smelled of burnt rubber and pine, thick with the promise of something terrible. He staggered to the front of the car, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The beam cut through the darkness, and there it was, a deer sprawled across the road in a broken heap. Its elegant neck was bent at an unnatural angle, its chestnut fur matted with blood that pooled beneath it, dark and glistening in the headlight's glare. David's stomach lurched. He dropped to his knees beside it, the asphalt biting into his skin through his jeans. His hand hovered over the animal's side. No warmth, no movement, just the stillness of death. He'd done this. He'd snuffed. Out of life in an instant. The weight of it crashed over him like a tidal wave. Guilt flooded his chest, thick and suffocating, squeezing until he could barely draw breath. He pressed his palms to his face, fingers digging into his scalp as a choked. Saab escaped. This wasn't just a deer. It was a mirror, a cruel reflection of the chaos he'd been drowning in for months, maybe years. Depression had been his shadow, relentless and unyielding. His job was a grindstone, wearing him down to dust. His apartment was a tomb of silence. His past a parade of regrets that haunted his every step. He'd been spiraling, losing himself to a void that whispered he wasn't worth saving. And now this, a life extinguished by his hands. Proof, it seemed, of the destruction he carried inside. He might have stayed there, lost in that pit of despair, if not for the sound. It was faint at first, a fragile thread weaving through the silence. A soft, trembling whimper from the shadows beyond the road. David froze, breath hitching, his head jerked up, eyes straining into the blackness. Something stirred, small and fleeting, just outside the reach of his headlights. A trick of the wind, a predator drawn by the kill. His pulse spiked, adrenaline surging as he pushed himself to his feet, legs wobbly beneath him. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, its beam slicing through the dark like a blade. And then he saw them. 3 tiny deer fawns huddled together in the underbrush. their spindly legs trembling as they stared at the lifeless body of their mother. Their eyes, huge, wet, glistening with confusion, locked onto her, then flicked to him. They were so small, so fragile, their coats dappled with white spots that shimmered faintly in the light. One of them let out a pitiful bleat, a sound that pierced straight through David's chest. He staggered back, hand flying to his mouth. Orphans. He'd made them orphans. The realization hit him like a sledgehammer, splintering what little composure he had left. Tears blurred his vision as he sank to his knees again, this time in front of the fawns. "I'm sorry," he rasped, voice raw and broken. "God, I'm so sorry." But words were useless, empty against the enormity of what he'd done. These little ones, so innocent, so defenseless, were alone now because of him. Their mother was gone, and they didn't even understand why. For a long, agonizing moment, he just stared at them, trapped in a storm of guilt and helplessness. The smallest fawn took a shaky step toward him, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. It stumbled, nearly falling, and something inside David cracked wide open. He couldn't leave them here, not to starve in the cold, not to be torn apart by coyotes or fade into the night like forgotten ghosts. His conscience roared to life, a desperate primal urge cutting through the fog of his despair. He had to do something, anything. Scrambling for his phone, he dialed the nearest wildlife rescue, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The line rang once, twice, 5 times. No answer. He cursed under his breath, tried again. Nothing. It was the dead of night. Who would pick up? Panic clawed at him as he scrolled through his options, each unanswered call tightening the knot in his gut. The fawns whimpered again, one of them nudging its mother's lifeless flank, and that was it. He couldn't wait. He wouldn't. With a trembling breath, he reached out and scooped up the smallest fawn. Its body was feather-light, warm and quivering against his chest. It didn't resist, just pressed closer, seeking comfort in his arms. His throat burned as he gathered the other two, their tiny hooves brushing his jacket, their breaths quick and shallow. He held them tight, feeling their fragility, their trust, and it broke him all over again. But it also lit a spark he hadn't felt in years. Back at the car, he yanked open the trunk, digging out an old wool blanket he kept for emergencies. He spread it across the passenger seat, smoothing it with care, then gently nestled the fawns inside. They curled into the fabric, a tangle of legs and fur, their eyes peering up at him, wide, uncertain, but alive. He climbed behind the wheel, hands still shaking, and punched emergency vet into his GPS. The screen blinked. 47 miles to the nearest clinic, a lifetime away. But he'd drive through hell itself if it meant saving them. The engine roared as he peeled back onto the highway, the night stretching out before him like an endless abyss. The fawns were silent now, their presence a quiet weight beside him. He stole glances at them, their tiny forms illuminated by the dashboard's glow, and found himself talking, low, unsteady words spilling out into the dark. "So you're gonna be okay," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "I'll get you somewhere safe, I promise." His voice cracked, but he kept going, weaving promises into the silence, promises he wasn't sure he could keep, but ones he needed to believe. The miles dragged on, each one a battle against exhaustion and doubt. The road twisted through the mountains, a ribbon of black flanked by towering pines that loomed like sentinels. His mind churned, replaying the crash. The deer's lifeless eyes, the fawn's trembling forms. He thought of his own life. The emptiness, the failures, the nights he'd stared at the ceiling, wondering why he bothered to wake up. He'd been running on fumes, a man half dead inside. And now here he was, racing through the dark with 3 lives in his hands, their survival tethered to his choices. Somewhere along that endless road, a shift began, a slow seismic crack in the foundation of his despair. This wasn't just about a deer, a crash, or a moment of reckless fate. It was about the fragility of life, his, theirs, everyone's. It was about the way a single second could shatter everything and then demand you pick up the pieces. The fawns weren't just victims of his mistake. They were a lifeline, a fragile thread pulling him back from the edge he'd been teetering on for too long. Dawn was breaking when he finally pulled into the clinic lot, the sky streaked with gold and pink, a fragile promise of light after the longest night of his life. He stumbled out, blanket bundled in his arms, and banged on the door until a bleary-eyed vet emerged. She took one look at the fawns, then at him, his bloodshot eyes, his tear-streaked face, and didn't ask questions. She just nodded, whisked them inside, and told him they'd do everything they could. David stood there watching through the glass as the fawns disappeared into the back, a hollow ache blooming in his chest. He climbed back into his car, the silence deafening without their presence. His hands rested on the wheel, still stained, with dirt and guilt, and he let out a long, shuddering breath. He didn't know if they'd make it. He didn't know if he would either. But as the sun climbed higher, warming the air, he felt something shift, something small, tender, and fiercely alive. Those fawns had given him a purpose, a fight he hadn't known he still had in him. They'd looked at him with those innocent eyes and seen not a failure, not a destroyer, but a savior. That night wasn't a random twist of fate. It was a reckoning, a brutal, beautiful collision of loss and redemption. As David drove away, the road unfurling before him, he understood. Sometimes, in the act of saving another, you stumble into saving yourself. Those three little fawns weren't just his burden, they were his mirror, his chance, his fragile new beginning. And as the horizon glowed brighter, he whispered a vow to the empty car. He'd keep going. For them. For himself. So, what's next? Does David find his footing? Do the fawns grow strong? That's a story still being written, one he'll carry in every step, every breath, every beat of his battered heart. And maybe it's a story for us too, a reminder that even in our blackest nights, there's a shadow of hope waiting, trembling, to be claimed. All it takes is the courage to reach for it.